after my own heart, or perhaps more properly, a man before my heart, responded that if Eliza got tired of it as a pet, she could at least have it cooked, as they made excellent eating. This didn't inspire a purchase from Eliza. Eliza at that point starts to get very anthropomorphic, wondering if a large toucan that she sees ever thinks of his forest home. She then obviously finds a close enclosure of hundreds of parakeets to her distaste. She describes the birds sitting in solemn silence, never moving an inch, for they were wedged in as closely as they could sit. After passing some rather fierce hyenas, wolves, and some deer too, Jamrach asks her to watch out that the camel in the cage doesn't chew her companion's hat. This concern about camels, hyenas, and concerns for the welfare of the animals didn't stop her eventually buying a pair of ruffed lemurs from Jamrach. Subsequently, she was to call them Spectre and Phantom. Another lesser-known author who writes about Jamrach was Richard Bell, and in his book My Strange Pets and Other Memories of Country Life, Bell describes buying 2 emus from Charles Jamrach for an outlay of £20. These he took home as pets for his children, who named them Tommy and Jenny. Bell had clearly developed a penchant for collecting these huge birds and sprung up a friendship with Jamrach, even travelling with him to Antwerp Zoo for the sale of birds and other animals. From Bell's book he writes, "I noticed that on all the enclosures and the cages the words en vente, and remarked that apparently the whole collection was going to be disposed of. But Mr. Jamrach told me that this was not the case, as only those birds and animals which could bring more money than was paid for them would be sold. When we were walking through the gardens, a lady accosted Mr. Jamrach, and they entered into a long and animated conversation, during which I had retired to a respectful distance, and of which I only caught the word tête rouge several times repeated, perhaps the only words I understood. After the lady departed, Mr. Jamrach told me she was the Princess somebody, and that they were discussing the possibility or impossibility of procuring a pair of birds so rare that he'd failed for some years to fulfil an order given to him by this noble customer. Mr. Jamrach made a great many purchasers at the sale in Antwerp Zoo, among which were 4 young giraffes. Regrettably, however, he told me that these arrived in London with broken necks owing to the rough sea passage. This was a very serious loss to him, as the price of such animals was almost as long as their necks. Later in his book, Bell states that he's developed an interest in meerkats, and so on arrival in London, he makes his way hurriedly to Jamrachs, who, unbelievably, is sold out of meerkats, though expects more coming in next week. What an incredible operation, imagine running out of meerkats. Bell meets Jamrach again when they both attend an auction at the disbandment of the famous Wombwell's menagerie. In attendance there were all the major animal importers of the day, including a Mr. Rice, who had latterly become Jamrach's biggest rival. Jamrach walked away from the sale with a brace of pelicans, 3 leopards, a performing tigress called Tipu, for which he paid £155, and perhaps the bargain of the day, a Tibetan sun bear for only £5. Jamrach did miss out on a polar bear for 40 quid, though one wonders what the bloody hell you'd do with a polar bear in the East End of London. Now, as well as being mentioned by famous authors, Jamrach also had famous patrons. One of these was the somewhat eclectic poet and artist Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Rossetti painted wonderful pictures, including that of a portrait of Persephone. Rossetti also assembled a menagerie of exotic animals at his house, from peacocks, raccoons, through kangaroos and armadillos to zebras, marmots, and even a Brahmin bull. In the house itself he kept mice, parrots, owls, woodchucks, even a wombat that was thought to have been bought from Charles Jamrach. Now, this wombat spent most of its time asleep in the central glass decoration of Rossetti's dining room table, and was almost certainly the inspiration for Lewis Carroll's Dormouse. Beyond the mention of Jamrachs by the literary greats of Victorian and Edwardian ages, There were a number of published articles, typically from the journals of the day, but some from books of lesser-known authors, and these tend to be much more explicit in their descriptions of Jamrach himself and his premises in St George's Street. An excellent example of this comes from the Reverend Harry Jones. Published in 1875, the Reverend was a neighbour of Charles Jamrach, and he comments that Jamrach had a shop in St George's Street and also had other premises in nearby Bett Street. He mentions that at any time Jamrach had lions, elephants, camels, leopards, beside the usual supply of monkeys, parrots and small deer. And one day he spies a bevy of owls looking quizzically back at him from Jamrach's window. In another window were white cockatoos, and in another were parakeets. Jamrach himself is described as having a form of mystical control over the animals. Reverend Jones has insight into Jamrach's price list and notes that the selling value of the wild beast varies very much. You must pay about £200 for a royal tiger and around £300 for a pair, whilst I'm informed that you may possibly buy a lion for £70 and a lioness for less. But a first-rate lion sometimes runs to a high figure, say even £300. Orangutans come at £20 each, but Barbary apes range from £3 to £4 apiece. Mr Jamrach, however, keeps no price catalogue for animals, but will supply a written list of their cost if needed. He doesn't, moreover, advertise so much as royally announce his arrivals. Certain papers in London, Paris, Berlin and Vienna occasionally contained a bare statement that such and such a beast was available at Jamrachs, no address being given. He has customers in all the zoological museums in Europe, and the Sultan of Constantinople has been one of the largest buyers of his tigers and parrots. The Sultan liked to have tigers roaming round in his gardens, a need that Jamrach met at £400 per pair. Some flavour is also gained in this text of the antiques and curios business that forms a part of the Jamrach Emporium. Among items listed include suits of armour, china, inlaid furniture, shells, idols, implements of savage warfare and whatnot. Another writer adds to this list Eastern musical instruments and even a life-size nude female model made in Japan, so lifelike that it looked real at first glance, and so cunningly made that it could be made to stand in almost any upright position. One item that Reverend Jones does not refer to is Jamrach's collection of Santas. Now, if you're imagining a collection of round, red, jolly-bearded St. Nicholases, you're going to be sorely disappointed. In fact, Santas are shrunken heads often worn by indigenous native peoples from Borneo and South America. These heads are collected from their battle victims and worn around the waist, not to show that you're really hard, which would certainly prove it to me. I for one wouldn't pick a fight with a bloke who's got a load of other blokes' heads on strings round his belt. No, instead the heads are worn to show the victim respect, and so that he can still have kinship even among his killer's tribe. Making a shrunken head was done by removing the skin from the skull. The skull and the brain were thrown away, and the skin was boiled briefly before being dried with hot pebbles and sand. The features of the face were preserved by shaping the skin with hot pebbles as the skin dried. The eyes and mouth were closed with cotton string, and the face blackened with vegetable dye. The head was then strung on a cord so that it could be worn at a ritual feast by the man who'd taken it. The Pitt Rivers Museum of Anthropology in Oxford has a fine collection of these Santas, and Charles Jamrach is credited with giving them Exhibit 1884-115, which was their first shrunken head to begin the collection. He also sold them an Indonesian bamboo headhunter's knife to the museum. This has 2 notches on the blade, indicating that it had been used successfully at least twice. And then my mother wonders why I had a ghoulish collection of birds' wings and formalised animal organs in my bedroom as a boy. I'm sure it must be a genetic thing. The Reverend also notes that Mr Jamrach not only collects in comparative detail, but does not overlook the purchase of a whole museum. And sometime prior to writing the article, it seems Jamrach had bought a museum in Toto all the way from Paris. So it certainly seems that Jamrach was an extremely wealthy man, though his wealth was not gained by overcharging his customers. Here the Reverend notes explicitly that people with money in their pockets can get a bargain at Jamrachs. In 1855, in his essay, The Wild Tribes of London, Watts Phillips reiterates a fairly malevolent description of the corruption he sees in the area around Ratcliffe Highway. But he also goes on to talk about some of the more interesting business premises there, including Jamrachs. He writes that Ratcliffe Highway can boast shops of all kinds, shops that purchase from as well as of sailors. There is the shop of naturalists, as full as parrots as a tropical forest, full of birds of all kinds and every plumage. From the pretty little waxbill, or the sunny canary with its melodious note, all the way to the more showy bishop bird. This bishop bird is so appropriately named. Who better housed, better fed, and higher priced, utters no note to speak of to redeem his keep. Well, they're the fashion, sir, said Mr. Jamrach, the proprietor, but they'll pass away. Again we look upon the useless bishop bird and devoutly hope that they will. Shells adorn these shop windows, shells resting on a bed of moss, some large enough to have cradled a sleeping Venus, others horn-like and twisted in their shape, like those through which the Tritons blew their songs of welcome to Neptune's bright-haired queen. Shells pleasing to look upon, whose rosy-lit loveliness makes the thought far away, till we forget the filth and misery around. As late as 1911, in his book, Off the Tracks in London by George Sims, the author describes seeing Icelandic ponies of Jamrachs taking the air in Prince's Square, close to the menagerie, right next door to the Swedish church there.